Find a quiet moment and imagine being completely alone. No noise, no movement, no one calling your name. Just stillness stretching for days. This is where the story of Jesus Christ begins, not in a city, not among people, but in the wilderness. 40 days. And in that silence, something approached, not loudly, not violently, but quietly, with questions, with offers, and with a choice that would define everything that followed. The wilderness was not a place people chose to stay in. It was a place people passed through quickly, carefully, and only when necessary. It offered no comfort, no protection, and no certainty. The ground was harsh, the air dry, and the silence carried a kind of weight that could not be ignored. There were no distractions there, nothing to soften thought or ease time. Everything slowed down, and in that slowing, every sensation became sharper. This is where Jesus went, not by accident and not without purpose. Before any public teaching, before the crowds began to gather, before any visible sign of what would come, there was this: withdrawal. A deliberate step away from everything familiar into a place where nothing external could support him. It was not a moment of weakness, but a moment of separation. At the beginning, the stillness would not have felt unusual. Silence can feel calm when it is new. The absence of noise can feel like relief. But silence changes as time passes. What begins as quiet becomes something else entirely. Without interruption, the mind does not stay still. It moves, reflects, questions. And without the presence of others, there is nothing to interrupt that process. Days passed. The body began to adjust, but not in a way that made things easier. Hunger is not immediate at its strongest. It builds. At first, it is manageable, almost familiar. But as time continues, it becomes more demanding. Energy fades, movement slows, even thought begins to feel heavier, as if each moment requires more effort than the last. Jesus remained. There was no attempt to shorten the time, no visible sign of resistance to the conditions. The purpose of being there was not to escape discomfort, but to endure it. And endurance, when extended, reveals more than strength. It reveals limits. By the time the days stretched into weeks, the physical condition would have changed significantly. Weakness would no longer be a possibility. It would be a reality. The body, deprived of what it needs, begins to conserve, to slow down, to focus only on what is essential. Every movement becomes intentional. Every action carries weight. But the physical aspect was only one part of the experience. Isolation does something that external difficulty does not. It removes distraction. In a populated place, there are always interruptions, voices, movement, tasks. In the wilderness, there was none of that. Time did not pass in the same way. Without structure, each day blended into the next, and the sense of duration became unclear. It is in that kind of environment that internal clarity either strengthens or weakens. Without external influence, thoughts are not shaped by others. They are faced directly, without interruption. This is where intention becomes important, because without a clear purpose, isolation can lead to uncertainty. But with purpose, it can become something else entirely. Jesus did not enter the wilderness without direction. The time there was not random. It was not a pause, it was preparation. But preparation for what was not yet visible. There were no crowds to observe, no outcomes to measure. Everything was internal, and everything was happening without an audience. As the 40th day approached, the physical condition would have reached its lowest point. Hunger would no longer feel like a temporary sensation. It would feel constant, unavoidable. Weakness would not come and go, it would remain. The body, having endured beyond its normal limits, would be in a state where even small actions required effort. And it is at this point, when strength is reduced, when conditions are at their most difficult, that the next part of the story begins. Not with a sound, not with a visible force, but with presence. Something approached. There was no announcement, no clear arrival. It did not break the silence. it entered it. And the first thing it brought was not pressure, not demand, but a question. A simple one. Direct. Focused on the one thing that was most immediate. Hunger. Turn these stones into bread. On the surface, the suggestion was practical. After 40 days without food, the need was real. The ability, according to what was known about Jesus, was not in question. This was not an impossible request. It was achievable. It would solve an immediate problem. It would restore strength. But what made the moment significant was not the suggestion itself. It was the context in which it was given. This was not about survival alone. It was about choice. Because the question was not whether he could do it. The question was whether he should. And in that moment, with no one else present, no one watching, and no external consequence visible, the first decision was made. The suggestion did not come with urgency. It did not demand an answer, and it did not repeat itself. It was placed into the silence as if it belonged there, as if it were simply another thought rising out of the stillness of the wilderness. But it was not the same as the thoughts that had come before. This one was precise. It targeted the exact point of weakness, the hunger that had been building for days, now fully present, unavoidable, and constant. Turn these stones into bread. At a surface level, nothing about it seemed unreasonable. After 40 days without food, the need was not theoretical. It was physical, immediate, and real. The body had reached a point where it could no longer ignore its condition. Strength had diminished, energy was low, and even standing or moving would require effort. In that state, solving the problem of hunger would not only be logical, it would be necessary. And that is what made the moment significant. The suggestion aligned perfectly with what the body required. It was not asking for something excessive. It was not offering something distant or abstract. It was focused on what was right in front of him, something that could be done immediately, something that would provide relief. But the situation was not defined by need alone. Jesus had entered the wilderness with purpose. The absence of food was not an accident. It was part of the experience. The hunger he felt was not a problem that needed to be solved. It was a condition that needed to be endured. And this is where the difference between ability and intention becomes clear. The question was not whether he could turn stones into bread. The question was whether he would. Because acting on the suggestion would not simply address hunger, it would change the nature of the entire experience. It would shift the focus from endurance to control, from purpose to immediate relief. It would take a moment that was meant to be sustained and turn it into something that was resolved. This is how temptation often presents itself. It does not begin with something obviously wrong. It begins with something that makes sense, something that aligns with immediate needs, something that appears reasonable, even beneficial. But beneath that surface, there is a deeper implication, one that is not immediately visible. In this case, the deeper implication was not about food. It was about direction. If the first response in the wilderness was to use power for personal relief, then the pattern would be set. The purpose of being there would shift. The focus would no longer be on what was intended, but on what was convenient. And once that shift occurs, it becomes easier to repeat. Jesus did not respond immediately. The silence remained, and within it, the weight of the decision was clear. There was no external pressure, no one watching, no consequence that would be visible in that moment. The choice existed entirely within him. And that is what made it significant. Because decisions made in isolation reveal something different than decisions made in public. Without an audience, there is no need to maintain appearance. There is no expectation to meet, no reaction to manage. What remains is intention, unfiltered, direct, and clear. When Jesus responded, the answer did not focus on the possibility of turning stones into bread. It did not argue against the logic of the suggestion. Instead, it addressed the foundation behind the decision. Man shall not live on bread alone. This was not a rejection of food itself. It was a statement about priority. It established that physical need, while real, was not the highest consideration. There was something beyond it, something that defined how decisions should be made, even in conditions where the body was at its weakest. With that response, the first suggestion was answered, not by denying its logic, but by placing it within a larger context. The silence returned, but it was no longer the same. Something had been established. The first decision had set a direction, and that direction would now influence what came next. Because the presence that had introduced the first suggestion did not leave. It remained, and it brought another question. The silence did not return to what it had been before. It carried something different now, not tension exactly, but awareness. The first exchange had established a pattern. The presence in the wilderness was not random, and the questions that followed would not be either. Each one would be directed, intentional, and timed. After the first refusal, the approach shifted. The next moment did not unfold slowly. It was not introduced with the same stillness as before. Instead, the scene changed. No longer just the open wilderness, but a place of height, structure, and visibility. The setting itself carried meaning. It was not chosen at random. Jesus was taken to a high point of the temple. From there, everything below would have been visible: movement, people, life continuing as it always had. It was a contrast to the isolation of the wilderness. Where the desert removed distraction, this place reintroduced it. It brought back the idea of being seen. And with that change in setting, the next suggestion was presented. If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. It was not framed as a command. It was framed as a test. This time, the focus was not on physical need. It was on identity. The statement introduced a condition: if you are. Not to question ability, but to provoke demonstration. It suggested that what was known internally should be proven externally. That certainty should be displayed in a way that others could recognize. And then it added justification. It is written, "He will command his angels concerning you, they will lift you up." The suggestion now carried support. It referenced something familiar, something authoritative. It was no longer just an idea. It was an idea reinforced by reasoning. This is how the second temptation differed from the first. The first appealed to hunger, something immediate and physical. The second appealed to validation, something internal but expressed externally. It introduced a different kind of question. Why not prove it? From that height, the action would have been visible. It would not have remained hidden. If the outcome followed what was suggested, it would confirm identity in a way that no explanation could. It would remove doubt, eliminate uncertainty, and establish recognition instantly. But the nature of the suggestion reveals its deeper purpose. It was not simply about proving identity. It was about controlling the terms under which that identity would be revealed. If Jesus had acted on it, the timing, the method, and the purpose would have been defined by the suggestion, not by intention. It would shift the direction from internal purpose to external demonstration. And like the first temptation, it appeared reasonable on the surface. If protection was promised, then acting on that promise would confirm it. If identity was true, then demonstrating it would remove doubt. Everything about the suggestion could be explained logically. But again, the question was not about possibility. It was about alignment. Jesus responded, not by rejecting the idea of protection, but by clarifying its use. It is also written, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." This response addressed the core of the suggestion. It did not deny what had been said, it reframed it. It established that trust is not something that needs to be proven through risk. That assurance does not require demonstration under self-imposed conditions. In other words, the existence of protection does not justify creating a situation to force it. With that, the second suggestion was answered. Again, not with resistance, but with clarity. The pattern continued, each response addressing not just the surface of the suggestion, but the principle behind it. And once again, the presence did not leave. The first attempt had focused on need. The second had focused on identity. The next would focus on something broader, something that extended beyond the wilderness, beyond the moment, and into the future itself. The pattern was now clear. Each moment was not random, and each suggestion was not isolated. They were connected, each one building on the last, moving from what was immediate to what was internal, and now toward something much larger. The setting shifted again. This time, the wilderness and the temple were both left behind. The place that followed was not defined by isolation or height alone, but by perspective. Jesus was shown something expansive, something that extended far beyond a single location. All the kingdoms of the world, their power, their structure, their influence. It was not a small offer. It was everything visible, everything that could be controlled, everything that represented authority at the highest level. Not in theory, but in reality. This was not about solving a temporary need or proving a point. This was about possession, complete, immediate, and without delay. And then the condition was given. All this I will give you, if you bow down and worship me. Unlike the previous suggestions, this one was direct. It did not disguise itself as necessity or validation. It presented the outcome clearly and attached a requirement that could not be misunderstood. Power without process, authority without time, influence without resistance. Everything that would normally take years, conflict, effort, endurance, was being offered instantly. This is what made the third temptation different. The first focused on survival. The second focused on identity. The third focused on control. And control, when offered without effort, is one of the most difficult things to refuse. Because it simplifies everything. It removes uncertainty. It replaces process with outcome. And it presents itself as a shortcut that achieves the same result but faster. At that moment, the wilderness no longer mattered. The hunger, the isolation, the physical weakness, none of it was the focus anymore. The offer extended beyond all of it. It suggested that everything ahead, the future, the influence, the impact, could be secured immediately. But like the previous temptations, the surface of the offer was not the full story. The condition revealed its cost. To accept the outcome, there would have to be a shift in allegiance, a change in what was placed at the center. It was not just about gaining something, it was about redefining what that gain was built on. And this is where the decision became absolute. There was no middle ground, no adjustment, no compromise, no interpretation that could align the condition with the original purpose. This was not a suggestion that could be reframed. It was one that had to be accepted or rejected entirely. Jesus responded with the same clarity that had defined the previous moments, but this time, the response carried finality. Away from me. The statement was direct, not extended, not explained. It did not engage with the offer, did not weigh its advantages or its logic. It dismissed it entirely. Then, the principle behind the rejection was stated. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. This response did not just answer the suggestion, it ended the pattern. Because the third temptation was not simply another option, it was the conclusion of everything that had been presented. If it had been accepted, it would have redefined every previous decision. It would have made the earlier refusals irrelevant. But it was not accepted. And with that, the sequence was complete. The presence that had introduced each suggestion, that had remained through each response, no longer had a place in the moment. It left. The wilderness returned to what it had been before, silent, still, unchanged. But the experience itself had changed everything. Because what had taken place over those 40 days was not just endurance. It was definition. Not of ability, not of identity alone, but of direction. Each decision had reinforced the same principle. That purpose would not be shaped by need, would not be proven through display, and would not be redirected by control. And with that established, the wilderness was no longer just a place of isolation. It had become the point where everything that followed was set into motion. After the final response, the stillness returned, but it was no longer the same stillness that had filled the wilderness at the beginning. What had once felt empty now carried a sense of completion. The sequence of questions had ended, the presence that brought them was gone, and what remained was not uncertainty, but clarity. The account describes that angels came and attended to Jesus Christ. This detail is brief, but significant. It marks a transition. The period of testing had concluded, and the condition of complete isolation was replaced with restoration. Strength, which had been reduced over 40 days, began to return, not instantly, but in a way that allowed the next phase to begin. What is important about this moment is not just the relief from physical weakness, but the position from which Jesus now moved forward. The decisions made in the wilderness were not isolated events. They established a foundation that would influence everything that followed. Each temptation had presented a different path. The first offered relief from physical need through immediate action. The second offered validation through public demonstration. The third offered control through compromise. And each time the response had been consistent, not reactive, not uncertain, but aligned with a clear principle that did not change based on circumstance. This consistency is what defines the significance of the wilderness. It was not simply a test to be passed, it was a framework to be established, a reference point that would remain constant, regardless of what followed. After leaving the wilderness, the environment changed completely. Isolation was replaced by interaction. Silence was replaced by voices. The absence of people was replaced by crowds that would grow over time. But the clarity formed during those 40 days did not depend on the environment. It had already been established. This is where the connection between the wilderness and everything that followed becomes clear. The decisions made in isolation would later be reflected in public moments. The refusal to act based on immediate need would appear again in situations where others expected action. The refusal to prove identity through display would appear in moments where proof was demanded. And the refusal to gain control through compromise would remain consistent, even when the opportunity presented itself in different forms. In other words, the wilderness was not separate from the rest of the story, it defined it. As Jesus began to move into the next phase, the focus shifted outward. He returned from isolation into a world that had not changed. The people, the systems, the expectations, all of it remained the same, but his position within it was now different. He did not begin with immediate recognition. There was no instant acknowledgement from everyone around him. Instead, the process unfolded gradually. He began to speak, to teach, and to interact with people in ways that reflected the clarity established earlier. Crowds started to gather. At first they were small, driven by curiosity or interest. Over time they grew larger, drawn by what they heard and what they witnessed. The teachings were not presented as abstract ideas. They were direct, practical, and often challenged the assumptions people already held. At the same time, there were moments that drew attention beyond words, acts that could not be explained through ordinary means. These moments contributed to the growing recognition of who he was, but they were never used in the way the second temptation had suggested. They were not performed to prove identity through display. They occurred within a context, aligned with purpose, not driven by demand. This distinction is important. because the ability to do something does not determine whether it should be done. And that principle, established in the wilderness, remained consistent. As the following period developed, opposition also began to form. Not immediately and not from everyone, but gradually. When something introduces a different way of thinking, it does not only attract attention, it also creates resistance. The clarity that had been formed in isolation now faced external challenge. But unlike the wilderness, these challenges came with visibility. They were observed, discussed, and responded to by others. The environment was no longer controlled, and the conditions were no longer predictable. Yet the pattern did not change. The same principles that guided the responses in the wilderness continued to guide decisions in public. The absence of immediate reaction, the refusal to act for display, and the avoidance of compromise remained consistent. And this consistency is what allowed the next phase to develop without losing direction. Because without that foundation, the increasing complexity of the situation, the growing attention, the rising expectations, the forming opposition, could have easily altered the course. But it did not, because what had been established in isolation was not dependent on the environment. As the public phase of Jesus Christ began to expand, the contrast between the wilderness and the world became more apparent. In the wilderness, there had been no audience, no pressure to respond in a certain way, and no expectation to meet. In the world outside, everything was different. People watched, questioned, reacted, and formed opinions. Every action carried visibility, and every word was heard by more than just a few. This shift introduced a new kind of challenge, not isolation but attention. Attention changes the way decisions are perceived. When no one is watching, choices are defined by intention alone. When many are watching, those same choices are interpreted, discussed, and often misunderstood. The presence of an audience creates expectation, and expectation can influence behavior if it is not managed carefully. What is important in this phase is that the pattern established in the wilderness did not change under attention. The same principles that guided decisions in isolation continued to guide them in public. This consistency is not automatic. It requires a clear reference point, something that does not shift based on environment. One of the earliest visible examples of this consistency was in how Jesus responded to requests for signs. As his reputation began to spread, people wanted confirmation. They wanted proof, something that would validate what they were hearing. This was not unusual. When something new appears, people look for evidence. But the way these requests were handled did not follow the expectation of demonstration. The second temptation in the wilderness had already addressed this. It had suggested that identity should be proven through visible action, through a moment that would remove all doubt instantly. That suggestion had been rejected, and the same reasoning applied here. Actions were not performed to satisfy curiosity or to establish recognition on demand. They occurred within a context, aligned with purpose rather than expectation. This meant that not every request was answered in the way people anticipated. Sometimes, instead of providing a direct sign, Jesus would respond with a statement or a question that shifted focus away from immediate proof and toward understanding. This approach created two different reactions. Some people were drawn to it. They recognized something different, something that did not rely on spectacle but on substance. Others were not satisfied. They expected clarity in a form they could easily recognize, and when that expectation was not met, they questioned what they were seeing. This division is a natural outcome of consistency in the face of expectation. At the same time, the teachings themselves began to shape how people understood what they were experiencing. They were not presented as abstract or distant ideas. They addressed practical aspects of life, how people think, how they act, how they relate to one another. But they often challenged existing assumptions. Instead of reinforcing what people already believed, the teachings introduced a different perspective, one that required reflection rather than immediate agreement. For example, the idea that external actions alone do not define a person's state, that intention matters as much as behavior, that what is internal influences what is visible. These were not concepts that could be accepted without consideration. They required a shift in how people viewed themselves and others. This shift was not easy for everyone. Some accepted it gradually, adjusting their understanding over time. Others resisted it, preferring to maintain the structure they were familiar with. Resistance does not always come from opposition alone. It can come from difficulty in changing perspective. As the number of people listening increased, so did the complexity of the environment. Different groups formed different interpretations. Some focused on the teachings, others on the actions, and others on how those actions related to existing systems. In this environment, maintaining clarity became more important than ever. Because when multiple interpretations exist, the original intention can become obscured if it is not consistently reinforced. Jesus continued to operate with the same alignment that had been established earlier. Decisions were not made to satisfy immediate demand. They were made based on purpose, even when that meant not meeting expectations. This is where the connection to the wilderness remains critical. The ability to remain consistent under attention depends on the clarity developed in isolation. Without that clarity, the pressure of expectation can lead to adjustment, small changes made to satisfy the audience, which over time can alter direction. But with a clear reference point, those adjustments are not necessary. As this phase continued, the responses to Jesus became more defined. Support grew stronger among those who understood the message, and resistance became more structured among those who did not accept it. This movement toward definition, where positions become clearer and less neutral, is a natural progression in any system where new ideas are introduced. And it set the stage for what would follow. Because the same consistency that attracted attention would also begin to create conflict. As the influence of Jesus Christ continued to grow, the environment around him became more defined. What had begun as curiosity developed into clear positions. People were no longer simply observing, they were deciding. Some chose to follow, others chose to question, and some began to oppose. This shift did not happen suddenly. It formed through repeated interaction. The teachings, the actions, and the consistency with which they were presented created a pattern that people could not ignore. Over time, that pattern forced a response. One of the main reasons for this growing division was not just what Jesus said, but how he said it. He did not present ideas in a way that adjusted to different audiences for approval. The same principles were applied consistently, regardless of who was listening. This meant that those who agreed found clarity, but those who disagreed found challenge. Challenge, when repeated, often leads to resistance. The existing systems at the time were structured, established, and supported by authority. They provided order and predictability. When a new perspective enters such a system, it is not immediately accepted. It is examined, compared, and often resisted, especially if it changes how authority is understood. Jesus' teachings frequently addressed internal intention rather than external compliance. This shifted the focus away from visible structure and toward personal responsibility. For some, this was freeing. For others, it was disruptive. As this difference became more apparent, opposition began to organize. It was no longer just individual disagreement. It became a collective effort to question, test, and challenge what was being said and done. This introduced a new kind of pressure. Unlike the wilderness, where the challenges were internal and direct, these challenges were external and complex. They involved dialogue, interpretation, and public response. They were observed by others, and each interaction contributed to how Jesus was perceived. In this environment, the earlier pattern remained unchanged. Questions were answered with clarity, but not always in the way they were expected. Instead of responding within the framework set by those asking, Jesus often reframed the question itself. This shifted the focus from surface-level issues to underlying principles. For example, when confronted with questions designed to create contradiction or expose inconsistency, the responses did not attempt to defend position through argument alone. They redirected attention to the intent behind the question. This approach made it difficult to reduce the discussion to simple categories of right and wrong. At the same time, the consistency of this approach made it difficult for opposition to dismiss him entirely. There was no visible contradiction to rely on. The same principles applied in one situation were applied in another. This created a form of stability that was not easily disrupted. However, consistency does not eliminate opposition. In some cases, it strengthens it. Because when a position cannot be easily challenged through inconsistency, it must be addressed through other means. As the interactions continued, the responses from those in opposition became more structured. They began to look for ways to test, not just through questions, but through situations designed to create difficulty. These situations were not random, they were constructed to produce a specific outcome. And this is where the connection to the wilderness becomes important again. The nature of the earlier temptations, targeting need, identity, and control, reappeared in different forms, not as direct offers but as situations that carried similar implications. Requests to act under pressure, to prove identity through demonstration, or to take control in a way that would alter direction. All of these appeared in different contexts. But the responses remained consistent. The clarity formed in isolation continued to guide decisions under pressure. The presence of an audience, the structure of opposition, and the complexity of the situation did not change the underlying approach. This consistency had two effects. It strengthened those who followed, because it provided a clear reference point. They could observe the pattern and understand the principles behind it. At the same time, it intensified opposition because it made compromise unlikely. When a position does not adjust under pressure, it becomes more difficult to integrate into an existing system. As a result, the environment became increasingly polarized. People were no longer neutral observers. They were aligned, either with what they understood or with what they chose to reject. This progression, from curiosity to alignment, is a natural outcome when something introduces a different way of thinking. And it set the stage for the next phase. Because when alignment becomes clear, conflict becomes more direct. As positions became more defined, the environment around Jesus Christ shifted from observation to confrontation. What had once been questions driven by curiosity increasingly became questions designed to challenge. The tone changed. The intention behind interactions became more deliberate, more focused on testing rather than understanding. This transition is important because it marks the point where differences are no longer passive. When ideas remain at the level of discussion, they can exist side by side. But when those ideas begin to influence behavior, structure, and authority, they move into a space where they must be addressed more directly. For Jesus, this meant that the situations he encountered were no longer neutral. They were constructed. The questions asked were often framed in ways that would force a difficult response, either to align with existing expectations or to contradict them. The goal was not simply to understand what he would say, but to create a moment that could be used against him. Despite this, the pattern of response did not change. Instead of reacting within the limits of the question, Jesus continued to address the underlying issue. He did not allow the structure of the challenge to define his answer. This is a critical point. When a question is designed to trap, answering it directly often leads into the trap itself. By reframing the situation, he avoided being confined to the options presented. This approach required clarity, not only in understanding the situation, but in maintaining alignment with the principles already established. The presence of pressure, especially public pressure, can lead to adjustment if the reference point is not stable. But in this case, the reference point had already been formed. As a result, each confrontation reinforced the same pattern. However, the effect of these interactions was cumulative. While some people continued to follow and support him, others became more firmly opposed. The gap between these groups widened. Neutral positions became less common, replaced by clearer alignment on one side or the other. At the same time, the visibility of these confrontations increased. They were no longer isolated events. They were observed, discussed, and interpreted by many. Each interaction contributed to how the situation was understood publicly. This created a feedback loop. The more visible the differences became, the more attention they attracted. The more attention they attracted, the more pressure was applied to resolve those differences. In this environment, maintaining consistency becomes more difficult. The number of variables increases, the expectations multiply, and the consequences of each decision extend further. Without a stable foundation, it would be easy for direction to shift under these conditions. But again, the earlier pattern remained. The decisions made in the wilderness, those that defined how to respond to need, identity, and control, continued to influence responses in these more complex situations. What had been established in isolation proved effective under pressure, not because the situations were the same, but because the principles behind them were consistent. As this phase progressed, the focus of opposition began to narrow. Instead of broad questioning, it moved toward specific outcomes. The intention was no longer just to challenge, but to create a result that would resolve the tension in one direction. This is the stage where conflict moves from discussion to action. The environment had reached a point where coexistence between the differing perspectives was becoming less sustainable. The differences were no longer theoretical, they were practical, affecting how people thought, acted, and aligned themselves. And when differences reach that level, they tend to produce a decisive moment. That moment does not come without preparation. It is the result of everything that has been building, each interaction, each response, each alignment. By the time it arrives, it is not unexpected. It is the next step in a progression that has already been set in motion. For Jesus, this meant that the next phase would not simply involve continued teaching or interaction. It would involve a shift in the nature of the situation itself. Because when pressure continues to increase and alignment becomes clear, the outcome begins to take shape. By this stage, the situation surrounding Jesus Christ had moved beyond discussion and into resolution. The progression that began with curiosity, moved through questioning, and developed into organized opposition was now approaching its outcome. The environment was no longer neutral, and the direction could no longer remain open-ended. The key factor at this point was not a single event, but the accumulation of everything that had happened before. Each interaction, each response, each decision had contributed to a structure that now defined the situation. The positions were clear, the alignment of people was established, and the differences were no longer something that could be ignored or balanced. What makes this phase important is how it reflects the same pattern seen in the wilderness, but on a larger scale. In the wilderness, the temptations focused on three areas: need, identity, and control. In this later stage, those same elements appeared again, but not as direct offers. Instead, they were expressed through circumstances. There was pressure related to immediate conditions, how to respond in situations where action could change the outcome quickly. There were challenges related to identity, questions of who he was, what authority he carried, and how that should be recognized. And there were opportunities related to control, ways in which influence could be used to alter the direction of events. The difference now was that these elements were no longer contained within isolation. They were embedded in a complex environment involving many people, many expectations, and many consequences. At this point, the possibility of compromise became more visible. When situations reach a critical stage, there are often options that appear to reduce conflict. These options may seem practical, offering a way to avoid tension or to resolve differences without escalation. But compromise, depending on its nature, can also change direction. In the earlier moments, the choices had been clear. The suggestions presented in the wilderness could be accepted or rejected without ambiguity. Now, the choices were less direct. They were embedded in circumstances, shaped by external factors and influenced by the actions of others. Despite this, the pattern remained unchanged. The responses continued to reflect the same alignment that had been established at the beginning. Decisions were not made based on immediate relief, public validation, or the opportunity to control the outcome. They remained consistent with the purpose that had been defined earlier. This consistency is what made the outcome unavoidable. Because when a position does not change under increasing pressure, the system around it must adjust. Either the position is integrated, or it is opposed in a way that resolves the tension. In this case, integration was no longer possible. The differences were too defined, the alignment too clear, and the implications too significant. As a result, the situation moved toward a resolution that would not depend on continued discussion or gradual adjustment. It would depend on a decisive action. From a structural perspective, this is the point where a system reaches its limit. The ability to maintain balance between differing elements is no longer sustainable, and a transition becomes necessary. That transition often takes the form of a single event, but it is not created by that event. It is the result of everything that has led up to it. For Jesus, this meant that the final phase would not be a continuation of the same pattern in a different form. It would be the conclusion of the pattern itself. And that conclusion would reflect the same principles that had guided every previous decision. Because consistency, when maintained over time, does not just influence direction, it determines outcome. The story of Jesus Christ, when viewed from beginning to end, is not defined by a single moment. It is defined by continuity, a consistent alignment that remains unchanged across different conditions, different environments, and increasing levels of complexity. It began in the wilderness, in a place where there were no external influences, only isolation, physical weakness, and direct confrontation with choice. In that environment, the foundation was established. The responses to the three temptations set a pattern that would guide everything that followed. That pattern was not based on circumstance. It was based on principle. When faced with need, the decision was not to act for immediate relief, but to maintain alignment with a greater purpose. When faced with the opportunity to prove identity, the decision was not to demonstrate for validation, but to avoid redefining that identity through external display. When faced with the offer of control, the decision was not to accept power through compromise, but to reject anything that altered the foundation. These decisions, made in isolation, became the reference point for every later situation. As the environment changed, moving from wilderness to public interaction, from isolation to attention, from curiosity to opposition, the same pattern continued. The presence of people, the increase in pressure, and the complexity of circumstances did not alter the direction that had been established. This is what gives the story its structure. It is not a sequence of unrelated events. It is a progression where each phase reflects the same underlying alignment. By the time the final stage was reached, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was the natural result of consistency. The same principles that guided the first decisions in the wilderness also guided the final decisions in a completely different environment. This is what makes the story significant.